I think my grandpa's old Mustang hides a dark secret. I had always known the 1964 Ford Mustang to be my grandpa's pride and joy. He barely let anyone else touch it, let alone drive it. I think he had bought it when it was brand new. He had probably paid a fair bit for it back then, but it was probably worth a lot more now. It was still in pristine condition, which is because of the love and care that my grandpa showed it. Most weekends you would find him washing the car and giving it a good polish. He did most of the mechanical work himself too. I don't think he would trust anyone else to work on it. I'm not a huge car person myself, so I don't fully understand my grandpa's obsession with the vehicle, but I have seen the joy that it has brought him, and I always like to see him happy. He lost a bit of his natural charm and joy when Grandma died a few years ago, but whenever I see him tinkering with the Mustang and I see the smile on his face and the twinkle in his eye, I begin to understand his passion for the car. My grandpa has always been slightly different. Don't get me wrong, he is a great man, a great father figure to me and a usually bright and cheery fellow. I guess what makes him a bit different is how particular he is about certain things. Everything needs to be done in a certain order or a certain way, and he can get quite frustrated if you don't follow his peculiar way of doing something. I remember when I was little, while visiting my grandparents, Grandpa tried to teach me that the only way to brush your teeth was by first squeezing the toothpaste into your mouth first and then start brushing. Or the other time when he insisted that the only way to get rid of the hiccups was to swallow a teaspoon of honey and then jump up and down 10 times. He has plenty of other strange customs and methods too. Whether it's always locking the basement door and not allowing anyone down there because you will let the sand out, whatever that means, or the fact that he hated the song Under the Boardwalk so much that he banned any mention of it. So, I guess that pretty much sums up my grandpa, a bit of a strange man with a bit of a strange obsession with his car. That's why I was so surprised when he actually let me drive it. It was early one morning. I had come around to visit him and try and get a few odd jobs done that he was no longer capable of doing himself. He was getting older, and I wanted to be a good grandson and help him out. When I arrived that morning, he answered the door still in his dressing gown. He invited me inside and asked if I wouldn't mind waiting for him in the kitchen. He was going to finish getting ready, but he was probably going to be another 10 or so minutes. I made my way to kitchen and sat down on one of the rock-hard wooden chairs that sat around the large kitchen table. Sitting in front of me was yesterday's newspaper, so I picked it up and started to read. I quickly skimmed the headline "Farmer claims to have seen Bigfoot on Shepherd's Road." I then read an article about the disappearance of Sandy Fraser, a woman who went missing over 40 years ago, and I was halfway through reading about the hitchhiker killer when Grandpa entered the kitchen. He was now dressed in an old pair of long pants, a dull green shirt and a woolen vest that sat over the top of the shirt. I almost immediately noticed that he had his hand held up high and he grasping a set of keys. "Today's your lucky day, champ," he said to me with a grin. "You get to drive the old girl." At first I couldn't believe what I had just heard. Had he really just said that I could drive the Mustang? Grandpa then walked closer to me and placed the keys into the palm of my hand. I felt the cold metal on my fingers, and I knew then that he was serious. I was going to get to drive the car. "I need you to collect a few things for me today," Grandpa then told me. "Now, as you know, I'm getting a bit too old to be driving here, there and everywhere, so I think it's best that you do it. Besides, it would be best if you get a bit of practice driving in the Ford, just in case someone leaves you in one in their will." As he finished the sentence, Grandpa gave me a slight smirk, and I swear that I saw him give me a wink. I was getting the car in the will? I really couldn't believe this. I must have been staring at him in disbelief because he then began to speak again. "Of course, you didn't hear that from me," he said with a bit of a chuckle, "and of course I will need to teach you a few things about driving her before you set off today." So, that's how I spent the next hour and a half learning all about the car's features and the best way to drive it. I learned how I should only adjust the mirrors whilst wearing gloves so that I didn't leave grubby fingerprints, and I learned that I should only use the windscreen wipers if it is an emergency. I also found out that the old AM radio no longer worked, and that was a good thing because listening to the radio while driving is a big distraction. I nodded and agreed to everything that Grandpa was telling me, but deep down I think we both knew I wasn't actually going to follow his advice. The last thing that he told me was that I needed to visit the shops that were in town, and then the best way to go to get there was down Shepherd's Road. Shepherd's Road is a small and narrow dirt road that used to be the main way into town, but once the highway was built, it pretty much became obsolete, but Grandpa still swears that it is the best way to travel to the town. I agreed that I would drive down Shepherd's Road instead of taking the smoother and much faster highway. After my long and not very informative lecture was over, it was time to hit the road. I hopped into the Mustang and fired her up. She roared into life, and I immediately understood Grandpa's love for the car. There was something about the way she sounded and the way that it felt while sitting in the driver's seat that made me feel powerful, a feeling I could get used to. I gave Grandpa a wave and took off slowly, trying to show him that I was taking care of his pride and joy. Once he was out of sight, however, I put my foot down and started to have a bit more fun with the car. I made my way out to the old dirt path known as Shepherd's Road, and before long, I was staring at the windy, dusty road. For a second, I thought about turning around and heading for the highway but decided against it. He would know I took the highway if I returned in a sparkling clean car and not a dusty and dirty car that would instantly need washing. So, I bit the bullet and started down Shepherd's Road. It was bumpy. My God, was it bumpy. I felt every little jolt and bounce, and it felt like I was operating a jackhammer, not driving a car. I persevered though and continued bouncing my way down the road. I didn't see any other car or living soul. Most people were smart enough to take the highway. I continued bouncing around in my seat for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes or so, when I saw her. She was walking down the center of the road. She was wearing an olden-style stripy frock. She was walking the same way that I was traveling, so I couldn't see her face. All I could see was the back of the frock she was wearing and the low-heel shoes that she was wearing on her feet. She was walking slowly, seemingly minding her own business. I don't think she heard me coming up behind her because she didn't turn around to look at me or acknowledge that I was there. I slowed the Mustang down and slowly approached the walking woman. Maybe I could give her a lift, I thought, but then my mind wandered back to the newspaper I had read that morning. The words hitchhiker killer entered my mind and I thought better of stopping and letting her in the car. I was now maybe 10 meters or so away from this woman and I began to drive out wide, trying to get the car as far away from her as possible. That's when the radio in the front of Mustang fired up and began to play. Under the Boardwalk came blaring out of the speakers. It gave me a fright and I jumped in my seat, this time because of the fear and not because of the bumpy road. I thought the radio was broken, but here it was, playing as clear and as loud as it would have when the car was new. "We'll be having some fun, under the boardwalk," the radio sung. I looked down for a moment, trying to figure out how to turn the stupid thing down, but I couldn't figure it out. I looked up at the road once more. I was now almost level with the walking woman, who still didn't appear to have noticed me. I was about to steer the car outwards just a little bit more just to make sure that I wouldn't hit her when I felt the steering wheel spin in my hands. It was spinning the other way. It was steering the car straight into the woman. The car was now directly in line with the woman. I quickly tried to find the brake with my foot, but as I lifted my foot off of the accelerator, I felt it push down all by itself. The car lurched forward, accelerating quickly. I heard the thud first and then saw the woman crash into the windscreen. Small cracks appeared where she struck the glass. She then rolled back off of the windscreen, onto the front of the car, then finally off the hood and onto the ground below. I had just hit someone. I didn't mean to. The car had done it itself, I was sure of it. It was the one that swerved and sped into her. That didn't matter now though. I was the one driving, so I was the one responsible. I sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I looked at the front of the car, and I could see the woman's legs poking out from front of the car. They were unmoving. I reached for the door handle, pulled it and got out of the car. I slowly walked to the front of the car and looked around and saw her lying there, in a pool of her own blood. The whole front of the car was covered in blood and my first thought was, that definitely needs a clean. I looked down at the woman and that's when I realized I recognized her. I had seen her just that morning. Not in person, but a photo of her. It was Sandy Fraser. The woman who had disappeared all those years ago. There wasn't something strange about her though. She still looked young, exactly like she did in the photo in the newspaper. She hadn't aged a day. This was very strange, and I really didn't know what to think. All I knew was that Grandpa was right. The radio was incredibly distracting while driving. If it hadn't started playing that bloody song, then none of this would have happened. I wouldn't have tried to turn it down and I wouldn't have hit this woman. But the fact remained the same. I had hit this woman. Now the question was, what do I do with her now? I really don't know what came over me when I made this decision, but I decided that the best course of action was to pick up her body and place it into the trunk of the car. I walked over to the body lying in the road, bent down and scooped her up. She was a lot heavier than she looked, but with a bit of effort I managed to lift her up and walk her to the back of the car. I had to put her down again to open up the trunk, but once it was open I lifted her up once again and I managed to stuff her body inside. I was closing the trunk when I saw it. I could have sworn just as the trunk closed, I saw Sandy open one of her eyes, but that wasn't an issue for now. I could deal with that later. The trunk was already closed, and so I made my way back to the front of the car and hopped back inside. I started up the Mustang again, and it roared into life. I closed my eyes for a second and then reopened then and found myself staring at the start of a dusty road and the street sign that read Shepherd's Road. I was back at the start of the road. In fact, I don't think I had even begun my journey down there yet. My windscreen was still in pristine condition, there was not a crack in sight. I felt as if I had just blacked out and everything I had just experienced was not real. Well, actually, I think it was real, but it was not my experience that I felt. I felt as if I now knew exactly what had happened to Sandy Fraser all those years ago. I'm not sure whether or not somehow the car showed me my grandpa's experience, his memory, or whether it was something else, but all I know is that I now knew something that only me and one other person knew. Now I had to decide, do I tell someone or do I continue to hide his secret?